how the Russia-Ukraine conflict seems to be posing the biggest challenge to India's presidency as the G20. How are you trying to overcome this global geopolitical conflict, which seems to be tearing apart any plan you may have to show the G20 and India's presidency as a massive success? How are you batting on this dangerous pitch?
First of all, Rahul, let me say it's a great pleasure to be back. At Indo, first you got to manage the curator, okay, to make sure that you don't have that much turn in the pitch that early. I think we did a decent job in two meetings so far, the finance ministers meeting and the foreign ministers meeting. How do we manage? To me, it's not just a question of managing the big geopolitical divide right now. It's a question of getting the G20 to go back to its original mandate. The G20 was invented to look at global development, to look at global growth, to address challenges to it. And what we saw last year was that that entire agenda got sidetracked by the Ukraine conflict and the debates that accompanied it. It was a particular concern for us because the consequences of the Ukraine conflict have actually aggravated what is already a very distressed global situation. You had the COVID, you had even pre-COVID, you had issues of debt which were increasing. So the energy spike, the food shortages, the fertilizer problems, these are actually big concerns of much of the world. But when you looked at the G20 for the last year, these concerns were peripheral. You could say understandably, the focus was entirely on the Ukraine conflict. So our first effort is really to get the G20 refocused on what it should be, its mandate. I think we succeeded in large measure in both the meetings which have issued documents so far. We were able to get a very, very substantial agreement. For example, in the foreign ministers one, there were 24 paragraphs, and many of these global concerns, health, debt, finance, even terrorism, counter-narcotics, all these we had agreement on. What we did not have agreement was on the issue of whether the Bali consensus, which was forged last November, in which we had a role as well, whether the Bali consensus could be rolled over for this year. And here, the Russians and the Chinese took a view that they would not agree to that. So what we did was we actually produced a hybrid document, you could say, which was a chairman's summary for those two paragraphs and an outcome for the rest of the document.
But your opponents in politics and quite a few diplomats have highlighted the absence of a joint communique, saying that oftentimes the success of a summit is determined by the outcome which is laid out in the joint communique. Given that you didn't have one in the finance ministers meeting and then in the foreign affairs meeting, your opponents will have their swords out saying Jaishankar has failed, India has failed, that nothing really came out of this G20 presidency except a chairman summary. How do you view this?
Chairman summary and an outcome document. That's what it's called.
How do you view this concern around because the same challenge could potentially persist to September, which is when G20 heads of state come to India for the leader summit?
Look, opponents will have the swords out no matter what, especially in our current state of politics. But if you look at it in a more informed basis, which opponents rarely do look at the Indonesian presidency. They actually went through a series of chairman summary till the very end, where finally with our collective efforts, we were able to get a Bali declaration. So if you're asking me how am I doing with respect to that, I've actually got a chairman summary and an outcome document. I've got out of a document of 24 paragraphs, I've got agreement on 22. So I would say in the given circumstance, I'm frankly doing as well as anybody can do. Now, you have people, you see, unfortunately, or you could say this is part of being in opposition. You can take positions which have no sense of realism, no sense of responsibility, as though a very serious conflict requires a diplomatic event in Delhi to be breached. There's a much bigger problem going on in Ukraine. The problem is not going to be sorted out in a conference in Delhi. The problem is going to be sorted out out there on, in Ukraine. So I think it's a non-serious proposition you're making.